There's a place in Middle-earth we all think we know. It sits in the south of a great, dark forest, a hill of barren rock crowned by a grim fortress. We know it as Dol Guldur, the Hill of Sorcery. In the popular telling, it's a haunted place, the lair of a shadowy figure called the Necromancer, a footnote in the grand adventure of a hobbit from the Shire. It's the place Gandalf slips away to while Thorin and company are stumbling through the spider-infested eaves of Mirkwood. He confronts the evil, he drives it out, a neat, tidy victory for the forces of good. But here's the thing nobody talks about. That isn't the real story. Not even close. The truth of what happened on that hill, the real reason it held the wisest beings in Middle-earth in a state of cold dread for nearly 2,000 years, is a far darker and more complex tale. It's a story of patience, of meticulous planning, and of a horror far more intimate than a distant, shadowy evil. It's the story of a laboratory, and the key to unlocking it lies in a journey that happened long before the quest for Erebor, a secret infiltration undertaken by a lone wizard, walking willingly into the heart of despair. Gandalf went in alone. What he found inside those walls is something Tolkien described in detail only once. In a passage buried deep in his auxiliary notes, a passage most people have never read. And what he uncovered there didn't just confirm a fear. It revealed a method. It exposed the terrible, industrial patience of an evil that was not merely biding its time, but actively, scientifically, perfecting its craft. What if the most terrifying thing about Sauron wasn't his power, but his process? To understand the secret of Dol Guldur, we have to rewind the clock. Way back, past the time of Bilbo Baggins, past even the glory days of the Dwarves of Erebor. We have to go back to the beginning of the Third Age, just after the last alliance of elves and men had thrown Sauron down and Isildur had cut the ring from his hand. Sauron, for all intents and purposes, was gone. A vanquished spirit, his physical form destroyed, his power shattered. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief. And for 1,000 years, there was a measure of peace. But evil, true evil, doesn't die. It waits. And around the year 1050 of the Third Age, a shadow began to stir. Not in Mordor. That land was still guarded, its memory too fresh, too raw. No, the shadow fell upon a different place, a green and beautiful forest known as Greenwood the Great. A darkness crept in from the south. The trees grew gnarled and sick, sunlight struggled to pierce the canopy, and foul creatures began to multiply in the gloom. The forest's name changed. It became Mirkwood, and at the heart of this growing sickness, on an old hill that was once a lonely outpost of the Sylvan Elves, a fortress rose. Dol Guldur. At first, no one knew the source of this power. The wise, the council of elves and wizards, suspected it was one of the Nazgul, perhaps even the Witch King himself, gathering strength in a new lair. It was a grave concern, certainly, but not an existential one. A ringwraith was a terrible foe, but a known quantity. They were lieutenants, not masters. But the shadow in Mirkwood felt different. It was subtle, pervasive. It didn't just radiate fear. It seemed to exude a corrupting intelligence, a will that was actively twisting the very nature of the forest around it. The evil was not just occupying the land, it was terraforming it. For centuries, this unease simmered. Gandalf, ever the most restless and suspicious of the Istari, argued for action. He sensed a single, guiding mind behind the darkness, a familiar and ancient malice, but he was overruled. Chief among those who urged caution was Saruman the White, the head of their order. He argued that the power was likely a Nazgul, and that their best course was to watch and wait. He even went so far as to suggest that the One Ring was likely lost forever, rolled down the river Anduin to the sea, and that without it, Sauron could never rise again to his full strength. His counsel seemed wise, it was logical, it was reassuring, and it was catastrophically wrong. Saruman was playing his own game, already secretly desiring the ring for himself and studying the arts of his enemy. His caution was a deliberate act of obstruction, a strategy to give the power in Dol Guldur time to grow, hoping it might draw the One Ring out of hiding, where he, Saruman, might find it first. This internal division, this seed of betrayal planted at the very heart of the White Council, is the first key to understanding Dol Guldur. The fortress was allowed to fester for centuries, not just because its master was cunning, but because his chief opponents were paralyzed by doubt and deceit from within. The greatest weapon of the Hill of Sorcery wasn't an army of orcs, it was the quiet, poisonous whisper of inaction. It was the lie that watching is the same as waiting. The years stretched into centuries. The shadow in Mirkwood deepened, its influence spreading like a stain. The free peoples of the north grew more isolated, the roads more dangerous. Still, the White Council hesitated. But Gandalf's unease never left him. He could feel the pressure building, the methodical intelligence in the dark growing more confident. He knew he could not wait for a consensus that might never come. So, around the year 2063, nearly 1,000 years after the fortress was first raised, Gandalf did what he always did when councils failed him. He acted. He went to Dol Guldur alone and in secret. This first infiltration is a quiet, shadowy event in the lore, often overlooked. He slipped past the unseen watchers, through the gates of dread and into the fortress itself. He walked its halls, peered into its dungeons, but he did not find the master. The Necromancer, it seemed, had fled before him. The fortress was not empty. It was still filled with menace and lurking horrors, but the central will, the commanding presence, was gone. At Gandalf's approach, Sauron had retreated, pulling back into the east to hide his identity and his plans for a little while longer. For the time being, it worked. Gandalf reported his findings to the council. The sorcerer had fled. A period of relative peace, known as the Watchful Peace, settled over the world. It lasted for nearly 400 years, but it was a false peace, a strategic pause. Sauron had not been defeated. He had simply made a tactical withdrawal. He had learned something crucial from Gandalf's intrusion. The wise were watching him. His secrecy was compromised. He needed more time, and he needed his enemies to believe they had won. And so he gave them the illusion of victory. The Watchful Peace was perhaps Sauron's most brilliant deception. It wasn't a truce. It was a long, slow exhalation. He allowed the world to relax, to let its guard down, to believe the threat had passed. He used those 400 years to consolidate his power in the east, to sway the hearts of the Easterling tribes, and to let the memory of his presence in Mirkwood fade into just another dark legend. While the White Council congratulated itself on its vigilance, Sauron was simply waiting for the Watchmen to get bored and turn their eyes elsewhere. And in the year 2460, when the world was well and truly distracted, he returned. He slipped back into Dol Guldur, but this time he came back with greater strength and a more focused purpose. The darkness in Mirkwood returned with a vengeance, fiercer and more malignant than before. This time, there was no mistaking the scale of the ambition at work. This was not the lair of a mere Nazgul. This was the command center of a rising empire of shadow. The fortress was no longer just a stronghold. It had become the capital of a kingdom of fear. The return of the Necromancer marked a new and terrible phase in the history of Dol Guldur. Sauron, now more secure, began to act more openly. His primary objective was singular and obsessive: to find the One Ring. But to do that, he first needed to recover the lesser rings and any information about the One's whereabouts. This is where the story of Dol Guldur intersects with the tragic fall of the Dwarves. Sauron knew that of the 7 rings given to the dwarf lords, 3 he had already recovered, and 4 were believed to have been consumed by dragonfire. But he could not be certain, and he knew that the greatest of the dwarven rings, the Ring of Thror, had been held by the king of Durin's folk. Thror, driven mad by the ring's influence and his lust for gold, had journeyed to the long-abandoned halls of Moria, where he was captured and butchered by the orc chieftain Azog. But what happened to his ring? Sauron's agents hunted for it, and his gaze fell upon Thror's heir, Thrain II. Thrain, now the keeper of the last of the 7, became a marked man. He, like his father, was consumed by a desire to reclaim his lost kingdom of Erebor from the dragon Smaug. He set out on his own quest, but he never reached the lonely mountain. He was hunted, pursued by orcs and other fell servants of the Necromancer. For years he wandered, a fugitive in his own lands. And one night, while sheltering under the eaves of Mirkwood, the shadow finally caught him. He was taken alive. He was dragged in chains to the fortress he had been trying to avoid. He was taken to Dol Guldur. Thrain was not merely imprisoned. He was taken to the lowest dungeons, to the pits of torment for interrogation. Sauron himself oversaw it. For years, the Dwarf King endured unimaginable suffering as the Dark Lord tried to break his will and force him to reveal the ring's location. Thrain, in the stubborn way of dwarves, resisted. He held on to his secret. Sauron, in his rage, took the ring by force, but Thrain still refused to yield any more information. So Sauron left him to rot, a broken, maddened thing in the deepest dark, his mind shattered into 1,000 pieces. This act, the capture and torture of a great king, sent a shockwave of fear through the world. But no one knew his fate for certain. He had simply vanished. Gandalf, however, suspected the truth. The disappearance of Thrain, combined with the escalating evil in Mirkwood, convinced him that the Necromancer and Sauron were one and the same, and that he was actively hunting the rings of power. The stakes had been raised. This was no longer a theoretical threat. It was a clear and present danger to all the free peoples. He once again urged the White Council to act, to assault the fortress and drive out the evil before it grew too strong. And once again, he was blocked by Saruman, who now openly coveted the ring and wanted Sauron to continue his search, hoping it would lead him to his prize. Frustrated and filled with a sense of impending doom, Gandalf knew he could wait no longer. He had to know the truth for himself, no matter the cost. And so, in the year 2850 of the Third Age, 91 years before Bilbo Baggins would leave his comfortable hole in the ground, Gandalf the Grey prepared for his second and far more perilous journey into the heart of the Hill of Sorcery. This time, he was not just an investigator. He was a rescuer and a spy walking into the enemy's headquarters on the eve of war. Imagine the scene. A lone figure in grey, staff in hand, moving through the twisted, lightless labyrinth of Mirkwood. The air is thick, venomous. The silence is not peaceful, but watchful, filled with the rustle of unseen things. Before him rises the black rock of Amon Lanc, and upon it, the dreadful towers of Dol Guldur. The fortress is not a grand Gothic castle like Barad-dûr. Tolkien's descriptions paint a picture of something more ancient, more crude, a place of raw stone, oppressive architecture, and deep, dark holes delved into the very heart of the hill. It is a place built not for glory, but for grim, silent work. Gandalf did not assault the gates. He used his arts, his knowledge of stealth and secrecy, to slip inside. What he found was a place transformed from his visit centuries earlier. It was no longer a half-empty lair. It was a thriving, horrifying metropolis of evil. The fortress was teeming with orcs, but they were not the disorganized rabble of the mountains. They were disciplined, well-armed, and filled with a cold purpose. He saw wargs and worse things, beasts of shadow bred for war. The entire fortress was a massive, functioning military base, a staging ground for a vast army. But it was what he discovered in the deeper levels, in the pits and dungeons, that chilled him to his very soul. This was not just a barracks, it was a laboratory. In the deepest chambers, he found sorcerers at work, poring over ancient forbidden texts. He saw alchemists brewing foul poisons and weavers creating banners emblazoned with a lidless, red eye. He felt the weight of spells of domination and fear being cast, their power radiating out to corrupt the surrounding land and the minds of men. Sauron was not merely gathering an army, he was rediscovering and refining his old powers. He was a craftsman, a fallen Maya of Owl the Smith, and his core nature was to make, to build, to order. Here in the dungeons of Dol Guldur, that nature was given its darkest expression. He was forging a new kind of warfare, one based on terror, deceit, and industrial-scale evil. And in the lowest of the pits, where not even the orc guards dared to tread, Gandalf found him. A creature huddled in the dark, muttering to himself, his mind long gone. He was ancient, bearded, with a wild look in his eyes. It took Gandalf a moment to recognize the emaciated figure as Thrain, once a proud king of the Dwarves. He was the living proof of Sauron's identity and his purpose. Thrain was dying. Years of torment had taken their toll. Gandalf tried to comfort him, to bring some light back to his shattered mind, but it was too late. The king was lost in a fog of madness and memory. Yet, in a final, fleeting moment of lucidity, he remembered the wizard's face. He remembered his duty. He pressed two objects into Gandalf's hand: a small strange key and an old creased map of the Lonely Mountain, marked with a secret entrance. These were the last heirlooms of the House of Durin, the tools needed to reclaim Erebor. Thrain had guarded them through all his suffering, a last act of defiance against the dark. With his final breath, he whispered of the ring that had been taken from him, the last of the seven. And then he was gone. Gandalf stood alone in the dark, the map and key in his hand, the body of a king at his feet. He now held the irrefutable proof. The Necromancer was Sauron. He was gathering his armies. He was hunting the rings of power. And he was personally overseeing a vast operation of sorcery and torment in the heart of Mirkwood. Gandalf barely escaped with his life. The alarm was raised. The fortress erupted like a disturbed hornet's nest. He was pursued through the dark corridors, fighting his way out with light and fire against a tide of shadows. He emerged from Dol Guldur a changed man, bearing not just a map, but a terrible burden of knowledge. He immediately went to the White Council and presented his evidence. He laid out the whole story: the army, the sorcery, the torture of Thrain, the confirmation that Sauron himself was the master of the fortress. He begged them, pleaded with them, to launch an immediate, full-scale assault. Surely now, with this undeniable proof, they would act. And still, Saruman resisted. His arguments were more subtle now. He conceded that the Necromancer was likely Sauron, but he argued that the Dark Lord could not regain his full power without the One Ring. He counselled patience, claiming that the ring would, in time, reveal itself, and that they should wait for that moment. "Let him gather his toys," he might have said. "The master key is still missing." It was a masterful piece of manipulation. He played on the council's fear and their hope, convincing them that a direct confrontation was too risky and that a waiting game was the wiser strategy. Elrond and Galadriel were filled with doubt, and Gandalf was once again outvoted. The window of opportunity, the chance to strike at Sauron while he was still consolidating his power, was slammed shut by the treachery of their own leader. Dol Guldur was left to fester for another 90 years. 90 years for Sauron to continue his work, to breed his armies, to perfect his spells, and to extend his shadow ever further, all while the wisest beings in the world debated strategy, paralyzed by a traitor in their midst. The terror of Dol Guldur wasn't just the evil within its walls, it was the power it had to project doubt and inaction outward, to turn the strength of the wise into a weakness. This is the pivot. This is the moment we must reframe everything we thought we knew about Sauron and his fortress in Mirkwood. Dol Guldur was not a simple hideout. It was not a place of hibernation. It was a research and development facility. Sauron, the former servant of Auli the Smith, is at his core a maker, an engineer. His entire philosophy is about order, control, and the perfection of systems. In the First Age, under Morgoth, he learned the arts of corruption, of twisting existing things, elves into orcs, nature into wasteland. In the Second Age, in the guise of Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, he perfected the art of subtle manipulation, using the craft of the rings to dominate the wills of others. His evil is not the chaotic, destructive rage of a dragon. It is the cold, methodical, patient evil of a corrupt industrialist. And Dol Guldur was his laboratory for the Third Age. Think about what Gandalf found. Not just an army, but an organized, disciplined force. Not just magic, but systematic sorcery, research, development, deployment. The pits were not just for punishment, but for experimentation. Was he attempting to breed new, more powerful strains of orcs? Was he creating the fell beasts that would later plague the skies? The texts are silent on the specifics, but the implication is terrifying. He was applying his ancient knowledge of making and smithing to the very stuff of life and death. He was perfecting his supply chain of terror. This is why the council was so afraid, and why Saruman's betrayal was so devastating. They weren't just facing a resurgent Dark Lord, they were facing an innovator of evil. Sauron was using his centuries of isolation in Dol Guldur to workshop the techniques he would later deploy on a massive scale from Mordor. He was testing the range of his influence, refining his methods of psychological warfare, and rebuilding his knowledge base. Dol Guldur was his pilot program. The darkening of Mirkwood was a field test for the eventual ruin of Mordor and the lands beyond. The fortress was a microcosm of his entire vision for Middle-earth, a perfectly ordered, perfectly controlled, perfectly efficient system of absolute domination, where every living thing was a cog in his great machine. The true horror that Gandalf carried out of that dungeon was not just the knowledge that Sauron is back. It was the realization of how he was back. He wasn't just a ghost re-embodying himself. He was a scientist who had been given 1,000 years in a secure, isolated lab to perfect his weapon. And the world had just stood by and let him do it. Finally, in 2941, the same year that Bilbo Baggins found the One Ring in a goblin cave, the White Council acted. Gandalf, using the unfolding quest of Erebor as a diversion and a catalyst, finally forced their hand. He argued that Sauron, learning of the dwarves' quest to reclaim the Lonely Mountain, might use the dragon Smaug as a devastating weapon, or seize the unguarded treasure of the mountain for himself. The threat of Sauron and a dragon forming an alliance was too terrible to contemplate. At long last, Saruman relented. seeing that Gandalf's plan might actually smoke the ring out of hiding. The White Council, united at last, put forth its full power and assaulted Dol Guldur. The battle was immense. Galadriel, Elrond, Saruman and Gandalf unleashed the power of the elven rings they bore. The fortress was broken, its foundations shaken, and its dark armies scattered. Sauron was driven out. On the surface, it was a great victory. The shadow was lifted from Mirkwood. The Necromancer was vanquished. The world celebrated, but Gandalf knew the truth. It was a hollow victory. Sauron had not been defeated. He had merely abandoned a position he no longer needed. The assault on Dol Guldur was not a surprise attack. It was an event he had anticipated and planned for. He had feigned a retreat, allowing the council to drive him out, while his most precious assets and his true seat of power had already been prepared far to the southeast. He fled from Dol Guldur, but he did not flee into hiding. He fled home, to Mordor. The fortress in Mirkwood had served its purpose. For nearly 2,000 years, it had been his shield, his laboratory, and his greatest deception. It had focused the attention of the wise on the wrong part of the map, while he quietly rebuilt the foundations of his true power in the Blackland. The victory at Dol Guldur was, in reality, a strategic masterpiece for Sauron. He traded a pawn for a queen. He let the council destroy his research facility only after all the research was complete, and the results had been transferred to his main factory. He abandoned the pilot program to launch the final product. 10 years later, he would declare himself openly from Barad-dûr, and the War of the Ring would begin. And the armies, the strategies, and the sorceries he would unleash upon the world were all born, nurtured, and perfected in the quiet, patient darkness of the Hill of Sorcery. So what is left of Dol Guldur? After the final defeat of Sauron and the destruction of the One Ring, the fortress was at last truly cleansed. Galadriel herself came from Lorien, and with the power of her elven ring, she threw down its walls, laid bare its pits, and let the light of the sun into its darkest corners. The forest began to heal. Mirkwood was no more. It was renamed Erin Lasgallen, the Wood of Green Leaves. The Hill of Dol Guldur became a part of Celeborn's expanded elven kingdom. A quiet, green place, its memory of evil slowly fading under the gentle pressure of new life. But its legacy remains. It's a legacy not written in stone, but in strategy. Dol Guldur teaches us a terrifying lesson about the nature of evil. It teaches us that the greatest threats are rarely the loudest. They don't always announce themselves with thunder and armies. Sometimes they begin as a quiet sickness in a forest, a rumor of a sorcerer on a forgotten hill. They grow in the spaces we neglect, nurtured by our inaction, our internal divisions, and our willingness to believe in a comfortable peace. It is a monument to patient, methodical malice. It reminds us that evil can be intelligent, strategic, and willing to play the long game. Sauron lost the battle of the last alliance, but he won the long, slow war of the watchful peace, simply by waiting for his enemies to lose focus. And in the end, the story of Dol Guldur circles back to that lone figure in grey, walking out of its gates with a terrible knowledge. Gandalf's true heroism wasn't just in facing down Balrogs or leading armies. It was in his willingness to look, to go into the dark places alone while others counseled delay, to see the truth, no matter how terrible, and to carry the weight of that knowledge, even when no one else would listen. He understood that you cannot defeat a shadow by pretending it isn't there. You have to walk into it. You have to measure its depth. And you have to understand the mind that casts it. That is the ultimate secret of the Hill of Sorcery. It wasn't a haunted house, it was a blueprint, and it took the courage of one wizard looking into its heart to finally read it. What shadows are we allowing to grow in our own quiet corners just because we are too afraid or too distracted to look?